The San Antonio Spurs have emerged one of the more interesting teams ahead of the NBA trade deadline. Despite the lowly spot in the standings and the bright future that they have behind Victor Wembanyama, it seems like they want to act now and begin to make some upgrades to this team. The Sixers are a team that could be a beneficiary of that, and while I'd recently dropped a video on the Cedi Osman and Doug McDermott options, I have a little bit of a sexier name that could keep people fired up on the Spurs that I do believe is available. Now, before I dive fully into it, I do want to make sure you guys are smashing that subscribe button. We want to get over to 3,000 subscribers by the end of January. We got to catch up to Celtics Digest over there. So if you could please help us out with that, continue supporting and helping to make this Sixers Digest family grow. Appreciate all you guys for tuning in. And to get into the meat and potatoes of what I want to talk about today, it is Keldon Johnson. So to begin about a little bit why, I want to dive into this article from Sixers Sense here, touches a little bit on the reasoning, and I want to elaborate from there. So to kick things off, it's written, quote, "One of the players who may not be in San Antonio's long-term plans is Keldon Johnson, the de facto team captain of the Spurs. The versatile wing is on the older side of their youth development and is shown to be a tricky fit next to Wembanyama, as shown in his realignment to bench duty as of late. Thus, he could and should be available for the plucking. Johnson's contract is one of the best bargains in the entire association. He just turned 24, a physical driver who can shoot threes, function as a release valve offensively, and play both wing positions as a normal power forward in spurts. Theoretically, he'll be a more measured, more insured version of Tobias Harris, who offers more upside without the unflattering price tag. That being said, the odds of the Spurs flipping him away this season is low. Greg Popovich has always preferred to keep corporate knowledge of his roster, much so the youngest one in the NBA. Johnson piloting their second unit also has been a good adjustment, and given that he's the voice of the team, he's likely not going anywhere, at least this year." So in this article, Johnson was labeled under the pipe dreams category, but frankly, I give it more of a chance to move on from Johnson than it seems to indicate in this article. So to talk a little bit about Johnson as a whole, I'll begin by pulling up his stats here. As you can see, he has seen his opportunity to regress a little bit this year after starting all 63 games last year, dropped from only starting 26 of a possible 38 games. His minutes per game has also gone down more from 32.7 to 31.4, and I'll say that of late, it has been even more significant than that he's had a couple 20-minute games and 5-point games, things like that, which are pretty surprising to me. But to touch on what he does as a whole, throughout his career, he's a 16.6 point per game scorer, also adds 5.6 rebounds, 2.3 assists, shooting 36% from beyond the three-point arc in his career. I won't say I'm the biggest Keldon Johnson guy, but this is a guy I'm pounding my table saying I love his game. I think he's a little bit overrated in some categories. I think a lot of people throw him into this 3-and-D category because people love to do that, and he is the archetype of player that kind of fits that. I'm not a massive fan of his defense. I think he's a little overrated on that side of the ball. That yes, he's young, yes, he's athletic, and yes, he has the tools to develop into that, but I haven't quite seen it. The film has not quite indicated at this point in time, in my opinion. But what does appeal to me, it is the value, it is the contract, and it is the fact that he's a potential buy low candidate there. To dive in the contract specifically, that he's making $20 million this season, and you can see, which is sometimes rare in the NBA, this number goes down to $19 million next year, $17.5 million the next 2 years. Think about that as the value of what Marcus Morris is making on the Sixers this year. And I think Keldon Johnson is a far better player than Marcus Morris Sr. While I'm appreciative of what he's bringing to this team, I don't think I'm going to get much pushback on that take there. Now, Daryl Morey has been very open about this cap space plan, about wanting to keep all options open for the next season, to have all the available money to throw as we get into the offseason. Now, this will be Daryl Morey's first true chance to paint his fingerprints on the Sixers roster. He's had to undo a lot of poor decisions from previous regimes, such as trading Al Horford, trading Ben Simmons, backing out of contracts that are overpaid. The light is at the end of the tunnel for that Tobias Harris deal, who, by the way, for somewhat similar production, is making literally twice what Keldon Johnson is, touching near $40 million on the cap for Tobias Harris specifically. So there will be some available funds for Morey to work with. To believe in Keldon Johnson or to make this trade would have to believe that Morey believes he could be a long-term piece of the puzzle. And I do think that could be the case, that I think he's the type of player worth taking a swing on, especially at what I perceive to be a discounted rate at this point in time. Now, one of the other benefits to bring on, and this is where I kind of don't see eye to eye with Daryl Morey on the structure for building a team, is cap space is great in theory. That, you have all these options, you can bring in all these players, but in actuality, it only works if it works out. If you find players to bring in, if you find the right pieces in free agency, and frankly, when you look at this free agent class, I don't know if it does it for me. That you can make a strong argument in today's NBA there's more value to having these inflated contracts that you can attach draft picks to and truly make a trade happen. That it is very rare at this point in time that we see a significant star level player change teams via free agency. It is so much more often via trade, and that works for both sides. For starters, for the team, that you don't want your best player to walk without getting anything in return. So the ultimate fear is that you let that guy hit free agency. That's why we see a player like Deonte Murray who has signed a contract and hasn't even had his extension kick in yet, but the Hawks wanted to make sure they get something in return knowing that he was going to leave. Now, speaking of Deonte Murray, the Spurs are also a team that he is attached to. And to dive into this report here, it was reported that earlier this week, after multiple reports that the Spurs were among the teams inquiring about Murray's availability in a trade, TNT's Dennis Scott reported that Murray told him, quote, "Pop is like a father to me. I would welcome it, but right now I'm a Hawk. Few believe he'll be a Hawk for long, though." So to touch on that, we know that, Dejounte Murray is the most likely all-star to be traded at this point in time. We've already seen OG Anunoby deal get done. We've seen the Pascal Siakam deal be concluded. And that Murray is a guy that, frankly, if you asked me before that, I would pin as the more likely of the three to get traded. So he does feel like the next big building block, the next big piece to fall in the trade market. And I think that there's a very likely chance that the Sixers are in the mix, whether that be to get Murray directly, which is seeming less and less likely based on the vibes coming out of the Sixers front office and the takes from Daryl Morey, or this could be a piece where the Sixers are part of the vessel to get a deal done. Make this a three-team trade. Make this a deal that works and help facilitate things for both sides. And I did get in the lab, cook up a potential mock trade here that I did want to bring up. This is not something that I have sources or whatever, but just something from my own brain that I did want to point out. So this is something that I could see potential working. The Sixers walking away with Keldon Johnson, the Spurs walking away with Dejounte Murray, and the Hawks getting their rebuilding package centered around Marcus Morris, Daniel House, 2 first-round picks from the Spurs, and a second-round pick for the Sixers there. Now, this is not a deal that I think the Hawks are going to be bragging about putting them over the edge in the point in time. And for the players specifically, Marcus Morris and Daniel House, 2 expiring contracts will be off the books. I think that's what the Hawks' desire is, that they've set 2 first-round picks seemingly as the price tag for Dejounte Murray. You get that through the Spurs in this deal. Now, to break this down individually for each team here, for the Sixers, you are trading Marcus Morris, Daniel House Jr., and a second-round pick to the Hawks and getting Keldon Johnson in return. That's a solid deal for the Sixers then. I do think the Spurs do it as well, is that they are giving up Keldon Johnson, who they do not seem to see a long-term future with, as well as 2 first-round picks for Dejounte Murray. That makes sense on their end. And then for the Hawks, you get that 2 first-round pick price tag, you get an additional draft pick from the Sixers there, and then you get expiring contracts to provide some cap relief this summer. So something like that deal could make sense to me. And that's kind of what I'm getting more of the sense that the Sixers want to be involved in, that it isn't this swing for the fence approach, that Daryl Morey wants to step in the batter's box. He sees the runners on base. He sees the championship trophy in sight. He thinks he can just knock in a runner in scoring position and ultimately get the Sixers to the finish line there. Whether or not that is true is a whole nother conversation. Frankly, I'm a little more of the mindset that there needs to be a dude in the trade, a guy that is a legitimate shot creator, a guy that you can run offense around, a two-way player type of this. But you can squint your eyes and kind of look at Keldon Johnson as that guy. So if that is the case, I do think it makes sense. And when getting back to this cap space plan by Daryl Morey, there is value in having these types of contracts on your books. That $17.5 million over the final 2 seasons of Keldon Johnson's career is going to age just fine. That's going to when he's going to be 26 and 27 years old. He is the archetype of player that teams fall in love with and overpay for. I'm not going to say he's as good as OG Anunoby, but look at the price tag that OG commanded in the recent trade market. I think Keldon Johnson has a chance to head down that archetype of player. If he buys in and commits on the defensive side of the ball in a way that I have not seen from him yet, I do believe that he could kind of climb into that type of 3-and-D conversation that teams just love to overpay for, and they're very functional in the modern NBA. So this is a little bit of kind of an investment move for the Sixers that could work out in their favor. And especially when considering there's kind of a lack of young talent on this Sixers team. Sure, there's Jaden Springer, obviously Tyrese Maxey, who is in a different class of all these names that we're bringing in. And frankly, if you ask me Tyrese Maxey or Dejounte Murray, one or the other, I'm thinking Tyrese Maxey 10 times out of 10. And I don't think Sixers people are in the minority for that. But I think league-wide that is pretty much understood at this point, which is really impressive and a testament to how much Tyrese Maxey has grown. But when you look beyond that for what these young pieces are, there's not a ton on this Sixers team. That a lot of the assets have been given up for veterans. They're one of the older teams across the league. So adding a splash of youth in Keldon Johnson, a player with potential who could reach other levels, those are all great things to have. So from chasing the championship immediately to extending your long-term future and just providing flexibility from an organizational standpoint, I think a trade for Keldon Johnson would accomplish a lot. And I do totally agree with the statement, as was initially said in the article, that said how Johnson is not one of their long-term pieces. I think that's absolutely the case, that he does seem to be well respected in that locker room, which makes him more appealing to me from a trade standpoint. But when you look at guys like Devin Vassell, like Jeremy Sochan, like Victor Wembanyama, obviously, there are guys that they're more invested in than Keldon Johnson. Johnson, to me, feels like a little bit of the leftover piece of the first core. They've now built a whole nother core. And yes, he's young, but it does feel like he's been there for quite some time. And I don't want to say worn out his welcome, but not a guy that has established himself as a firm piece of the future. And that's even more indicative of the way that he's coming off the bench lately and seeing his minutes drop. So if that is the case, if he's available for trade, and if the Spurs truly have this hunger to get Dejounte Murray, I think it would be a great move by Daryl Morey to get in the mix, get a piece out of this. And I do think Keldon Johnson is a guy that potentially changes things from these Sixers in a standpoint that could be different. That it's a whole different ball game as far as expectations when you're playing on a contender. We've yet to see that be the case in Keldon Johnson's career, but he's shown me enough to think I'm curious to see what that would look like. I do want to hear what you guys think in the comments, though, so make sure you drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on Keldon Johnson. Does that move the championship meter to any extent for you, or do you think it's worth it to have this long-term flexibility that we'd also bring on? Either way, let me know. Make sure that you are smashing that subscribe button, dropping a like on this video, and I'll be talking to you next time right here on Sixers Digest.